So it's six past the hour. I'm sure more people will join. This is being recorded. So let's begin. So we'll do the official To Save Us from Hell opening. Welcome to Save Us from Hell. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am the editor-in-chief of UN Dispatch. I run Global Dispatches. I'm a journalist who's covered the United Nations for nearly 20 years, and I am joined, as always, by...
I'm Anjali Dayal, an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York.
And Anjali, we are
hmm
speaking about 20 minutes
hmm
following the conclusion of Elise Stefanik's confirmation hearing for United Nations ambassador. Now, I was keenly interested in watching this confirmation hearing for all the obvious reasons, but maybe none more so than the fact that Elise Stefanik just does not have a huge foreign policy pedigree. Her
hmm
record on the United Nations is relatively thin. So, frankly, I didn't know a lot of her
Yeah.
deep seated opinions, views on the United Nations. She is something of a malleable political figure. Having become a Trump loyalist after having spent a lot of time as more or less like a conventional Republican. So, frankly,
Yeah.
I didn't know what to expect from this hearing. Anjali, I'm just going to kick it off to you. What are your kind of biggest takeaways? What are big moments, big takeaways from you? And we'll get right into it.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting because, like you said, she has the classical training of an old school Republican. She started out, as we heard today, on the in the confirmation hearings in the Bush White House, and she helped prep pre-Trump Republican political candidates for debates. So she has training in the kind of old school Republican foreign policy that she really put on the table today. She made a big bipartisan pitch to be confirmed, and I don't know for sure, obviously, because Tim Kaine at least was not thrilled with what he heard from her. But I would guess that she is confirmed by a pretty significant majority, if not the same 99 to 0 as Marco Rubio was confirmed, in part because she made a big effort to emphasize traditional Republican foreign policy goals and place them in the context of Donald Trump's foreign policy. She talked a lot about America first, peace through strength. That is, you know, it has to our ears an un-American sound to it, I think, but it has old strands in American foreign policy, and the policies she was putting on the table were not so different, except at the very margins from conventional Republican foreign policies. At the very margins matters a lot, I think, because the two people who introduced her, Tom Cotton and Shelley Morgapito, right? Um, Sort of represent the two wings of the Republican Party at this point, with Tom Cotton's bombastic pro MAGA send in the military to take down peaceful protesters on the one hand, and Shelley Capito Moore's traditional we need to reform the UN on the other hand. And we really see that she has the full buy-in of both ends of the
Mhm.
party there. So I thought that was
Yeah,
very
so big,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, so agree with you. Big picture, she will be confirmed. She made a deliberate effort
Yes,
to, not be too controversial. That
absolutely.
might scare away, any. And I should say she'll be confirmed with Democratic support. She would have been
Yes.
confirmed anyway, but she'll get
Yeah.
likely significant Democratic support.
Yeah.
So to me, I honestly, for the reasons I explained earlier, did not know what to expect from her
Yeah.
coming into this hearing. On the one hand, she has a record as a member of
Mhm.
Congress voting to totally defund the United
Yeah.
Nations. Then last night, we saw this executive order issued by the Trump administration to withdraw from the World Health Organization.
Mhm.
So a part of me would not have been surprised if Elise Stefanik, who is like a puncher, she is like
Yeah.
she is a bomb thrower when she wants to be, could
Yeah.
have come out there guns ablazing and just spent her confirmation hearing tearing into the UN and describing all of its faults and demerits and making the case for American withdrawal even from the United Nations itself. But she did not. As
No.
you noted, she sounded very much like a conventional Republican. And the
Yeah.
ways that conventional Republicans talk about the UN were very much
Mhm.
reflected
Yeah.
in Elise Stefanik's hearing. She didn't sound like super MAGA-y.
Mm.
She sounded like a normie Republican, which frankly, I know, Anjali, you're not too far from the United Nations right now. I don't know if there's like a giant like wind, a sigh of relief blowing from Turtle Bay across Manhattan right now. But if I am sitting in Turtle Bay, if I'm at the United Nations, I am kind of relieved with what I saw, considering
Yeah.
what happened with the World Health Organization last night and what could have been. But this was like normie Republican stuff. And we'll
Yeah.
get into why that is in a second.
Well, I would say two things. The first is that I do think, right? I mean, at one point she said she wanted to be like Daniel Patrick Moynihan at the UN, which is a like shameless play to curry democratic support, right? Um, but I do think we should look in two places. The first is that she did make a play for conventional sort of Republican, and when we say conventional Republican, we mean pre-MAGA Republican
Mm-hmm.
values in the sort of old school um, liberal internationalist tradition, as opposed to the strain of the Republican Party, which is more isolationist, right? Um, that said, there were moments where she got it into it with Tim Kaine, she got it into it with Van Hollen, right? Where you could see exactly the strand of like pugnacious fighter for Donald Trump's values that earned her the slot to begin with. There's also the moment where she very clearly told Chris Murphy that she did not see Elon Musk um, put up the Nazi salute twice last night.
Yeah.
Now, that I think while I agree with you, I think people around the UN will breathe a sigh of relief because in some ways she's in the Nikki Haley model of wanting to reform the UN, but being therefore someone that Antonio Guterres can work with to put forth reforms to the United Nations in a way that reframes them as being in line with what Donald Trump wants, in line with the US's stated interests.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, right, she will get up there and lie and say what she knows to be not true because she's smart, right?
Mm-hmm.
She knows a Nazi salute when she sees one. The fact that she will get up there and tell Chris Murphy that she did not see what everybody knows she saw tells us also that she will be in Donald Trump's pocket, right?
Yeah.
That she is in the sense of, she is in the model of being able to talk the talk that looks good to people, but also maybe not striking out in ways that don't advance her political power. Now, I
Yeah.
do think, she could have gone out and said, like you suggested, bombastic, all all sort of pistols blazing, let's defund the UN, let's back out, but that wouldn't serve her ambition and her
Yeah.
political power, right? And she did firmly, repeatedly say that she wants the UN to work in US interests, right?
Yeah.
She was asked about the Abraham Accords and whether that meant, for example, that we could make bilateral and multilateral deals outside the UN, and if so, why not? And she very explicitly said, I think we should build a coalition inside the UN for the Abraham Accords, placing her own interests, her own power, and US interests firmly within the UN system.
Yeah. So maybe let's go through
Hmm.
two of those moments that were not particularly substantive on UN issues, but
Hmm.
to the extent that people in like the general kind of news consuming audience pay attention to this hearing at all, there are two clips that'll likely be replayed. The first you
Hmm.
referenced is
Hmm.
Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut and
Hmm.
past guest of the Global Dispatches podcast a couple times now. So the context here is that Elise Stefanik repeatedly and vigorously vowed to fight anti-Semitism, as she
That's
claims
right.
the UN is anti-Semitic, it's anti-Israel, and she's there to fight the good fight in defense of Israel and to counter anti-Semitism. And so that was kind of the perfect setup for Chris Murphy to ask her about Elon Musk's Nazi
Hmm.
salute last night. And she said, well, I don't know what you're talking about. That wasn't a Nazi salute. And so it obviously demonstrated, as you said, her
Hmm.
unwillingness to call out anti-Semitism when it is, when it's done by one side, but only focuses on the other. So that kind of undermined, her credibility, if she had any, as like a anti as someone who astutously fights anti-Semitism wherever it is. So that's number one. The second kind of
Mhm.
moment that I think is getting, frankly, a lot of traction on social media right now was her response to a question from Chris Van Hollen, the Democrat from Maryland, who apparently told her in private, and they met privately ahead of time,
Mhm.
and Stefanik apparently in private told Chris Van
Mhm.
Hollen that she agrees with extreme Israeli right wingers Smoltrik and Ben Gvir, two members of the Israeli government at the moment, that Israel has a biblical claim to the West Bank. And she said, yes, I agree with that statement. So she
Mhm.
agrees that Israel has a biblical claim to the West Bank. Now, this will impact diplomacy at the United Nations. So the United States is already, as far as these things go, very isolated at the
Yeah.
UN when it comes to Israel Palestine issues. And her aligning herself with the most extreme element of Israeli politics on this question is going to be harmful to her ability to kind of to do diplomacy on the Israel Palestine portfolio. Not that I think there's going to be easygoing to start with. But those are, I think, the
Yeah.
two kind of moments from the hearing that non-UN watchers will have
Yeah.
kind of encountered. So I want to give some context to that.
Yeah. And I do think, it's worth noting that the isolation for the US, the UN wouldn't be new, right? And so it might be noteworthy outside UN circles, but in UN circles, it would be a slight difference with the current US stance at
Mhm.
the UN vis-a-vis Israel and Gaza, not a significant break, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
That would be my impression, at least.
No, I agree with that.
Yeah.
So let's discuss what we think made her
Hmm.
sound like a normie, conventional, pre-MAGA Republican at this confirmation hearing. I'll cite a couple of things.
Hmm.
First, off the bat, she heaped lots of praise on the World
Yeah.
Food Program and
Yeah.
UNICEF.
Yeah.
Um, you know, articulating in I think really important ways how
Hmm.
these two agencies advance American interests and American values.
Yeah.
And notably, Cindy McCain, not a Trump supporter, is head of the
No.
World Food Program at the
Yeah.
moment. And so the fact that her very full-throated support of these two UN entities
Hmm.
came right after the the Trump administration issued an executive order to withdraw the
Yeah.
U.S. from the World Health Organization is significant and notable.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is notable. I also think, part of what made her sound like a normie candidate is that she did her homework. We've talked about this before. She's smart. She is a quick study. She will learn things about the portfolio she's given. So even though she doesn't have a substantial UN or foreign policy portfolio or stance before this point, she hasn't had one. She put in the time. She learned a lot about the UN. And she talked at length about UN elections, about UN personnel appointments, about its staffing, about the technical agencies of the UN and the importance of US representation at the technical representation of the technical agencies of the UN. And in particular, she did all of that within the context of essentially saying the smart thing for the US to do to advance its interests is to maintain its presence, for the US and its allies to maintain its presence at the UN, um, in instead of withdrawing, right? Instead of
Mhm.
ceding the space to China. And so in that sense, she managed to find ground that was both sort of traditional GOP and in line with the sort of China hawk positioning of the MAGA movement. She also talked at length about doing an agency by agency review, noted that what she wanted was transparent, effective agencies that worked well. And in that sense, she is in line with an old school Republican approach to the United Nations, which sees value in investing in the agency, but sees value in investing in the excuse me the organization, but sees value in investing in the organization insofar as it gives American voters value for their tax dollar. And she repeatedly hit that point. She said
Mhm.
it is good and important to have presence here, but we want to make sure it's serving the purposes of the US taxpayer. And the other thing she kept saying was in line with the original foundation of the UN Charter. And emphasizing the sort of classic values of the UN Charter, that is an old school Republican
Mhm.
talking point. It is not a talking point that sits comfortably alongside either Project 2025 or sort of Donald Trump's personal policy preferences as he's expressed them, which run towards more 19th century imperialism.
Mhm. Yeah, and I would add another, and very similar to what you were just saying,
Hmm.
another thing that caught my ear that again suggests that she's approaching the UN in kind of normie Republican
Hmm.
ways is how she is seeking to tie US funding to
Yeah.
reforms at the United Nations. Now, like big picture historically, there's like a broad bipartisan consensus, like in the pre-MAGA era, that the UN like serves American interests broadly speaking, right?
Yeah.
Like conventional liberals and conventional Republicans generally agree on that big picture question. Where Republicans and Democrats have differed over the last several decades is that Republicans seek to like impose reforms on the UN by threatening to withhold funding. And if certain reforms are not enacted, the U.S. will use its like power of the purse to just
Hmm.
like starve the UN until it accedes to American demands. Whereas the Democrats have
Yeah.
typically not taken that particular approach. We can be sure that Elise
Yeah.
Stefanik and the Trump administration will take that approach. Now, what specific reforms they will demand, we don't yet know, but
Right.
we do know that they will threaten to withhold American funding unless or until certain reforms are met. And my regret with this hearing is
Yeah.
that there wasn't a huge amount of questions around what specific reforms the Trump administration would demand of the UN. And that was not something that was really treated with much depth at all in this hearing, and something I think was really like a missed opportunity for the senators asking her questions.
Yeah, I think so. The only place I think where we got sort of, well, we did, as you said at the outset, get her sense of what agencies would persist, right, as being important to the U.S., the World Food Program, UNICEF, which agencies would continue to not be funded by the U.S., UNRWA, right? The critical place I thought that they got into this during the hearing was between her and Senator Shaheen on the question of the UN Population Fund.
Yes, I'm glad you
Um,
brought that up. That's on my list.
yeah.
I promise.
Yeah.
UNFPA Shaheen. Please.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, essentially, Senator Shaheen's concern, traditional Republican move is to defund the United Nations Population Fund.
Yes. Every just
And
just just
that,
just to set this up,
yeah, 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 go ahead.
every Republican
Hmm.
since Ronald Reagan has withheld American funding for the UN Population Fund. Every Democratic president has restored it. It's caught up in domestic American politics about abortion, even though the UN Population Fund doesn't actually do abortion. But go ahead.
Right. And so Senator Shaheen wanted to secure a promise from Representative Stefanik about not immediately defunding the United Nations Population Fund and all the critical work that it does. And she specifically pointed to the work that it does in combating female genital mutilation, for example, and in maternal health. And, in that back and forth, I thought it was interesting that Stefanik did not take a hardline approach still. Essentially, she said, I am committed to doing an agency by agency review to see what serves US interests and what doesn't. Now, clearly, that's not a no, we will not defund the United Nations Population Fund. But she did go on to say, I think of myself, I think I have a proven record of being an advocate for women's health. And so, whether that is an effort to just curry favor with the committee at that moment or not, I think it's more likely to be an effort to curry favor with the committee, right?
Yeah.
Like,
In
Stefanik
in
knows where her
in
bread is buttered, right?
in my notes, I wrote that the UN Population Fund got a stay of execution. It will get defunded, but
Yeah.
maybe not like within the first 10 days of the Trump administration. But It will. It will be defunded like every Republican president does. But it was interesting, as you noted, that she didn't come off the bat and started talking about like
Yeah.
UNFPA and abortion and its alleged participation in sterilization of women in China, which has been like
Yeah.
debunked. But that's been another thing that's been invoked to defund UNFPA. So she didn't like get into that. She just like more generally talked about like, we'll look into it, which again, it will be defunded, but not immediately. So
Yeah.
any second house for accounts for these UN agencies that are voluntarily funded, and that's what's interesting too about the World Food Program and UNICEF. Like these are agencies that basically run like charities. Their biggest
Yeah.
donors are governments around the world, none larger than the United States. So seeing
Yeah.
Stefanik, double down her support for some UN humanitarian agencies like the World Food Program, like UNICEF, is again reassuring,
Yeah.
at least from at least from the UN's perspective. Now, you also noted earlier that she
Mhm.
several times invoked the important role of the UN technical agencies. This is
Yes.
like the alphabet soup of UN agencies that no
Mhm.
one's ever heard of, but does really important work that like
Mhm.
impact the day-to-day lives of people. Most
That's
of these
right.
are in Switzerland, most are in Geneva, and basically they help set standards on technology issues, on aviation, like you name it. There's like
Yeah.
any number of things that you deal with on any
Mhm.
given day, have like kind of run through the UN technical agencies for
Yeah.
just like for guidance more than anything else.
Mhm.
And she assured senators that the U.S. will stay involved in these technical agencies in order for the U.S. to have a role in setting the standards. And again, this
Yeah.
goes back to your original point of like wanting to be in the room and shaping
Mhm.
outcomes as opposed to kind of complaining from the sidelines. Taking as the Hawaiian Senator Brian Schott said, taking your marbles and leaving the game.
Right. Um, and I think it's she cited a couple of technical agencies by name. She talked about the telecommunications work that the UN does and the civil aviation work that the UN does. And in both cases, adding UNESCO to this list, right? UNESCO, not a technical agency, but sort of a classic usual target of Republican ire. Um, in all three cases, she said, we do not want to cede this ground to China, as has happened in the past. And so I think she's doing something, she's walking a really interesting tightrope, right? Her political fate, her original set of political predispositions when she first entered Congress lie in a kind of internationalism, liberal internationalism, that has traditionally underwritten the US approach to the United Nations. Um, but she's trying to undertake this role in the context of an administration that does not have this fidelity to these values. And she's doing it by sort of framing this as being in the US's interests geopolitically to counter China.
Yeah.
And I think that that is a fundamentally different approach than, say, Nikki Haley took, because Nikki Haley is an old school liberal internationalist of a different generation, a different caste, who could walk that tightrope in a slightly different way. Um, but in Stefanik's case, it seems very much like she wants to sit down, and we've talked about this before on the podcast and in other places, but Donald Trump is not reflexively hostile to the UN. He likes the pomp and circumstance. He likes being there. He likes being able to engage in the sort of personal dimensions of diplomacy. He likes that he's important there. And because of that, there is space, not just for his buy in, but for the buy in of his China hawk allies, I think,
Mhm.
to help her advance her own career and her own goals at the UN. And that should, as you said at the outset, be sort of reassuring to top UN diplomats, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just following on this point. So Elise Stefanik was the first cabinet member
Hmm.
nominated by Donald
Hmm.
Trump following his election. Just a couple days after, like I think it was November like 12th or something like that. She was
Yeah.
named as his pick to be a UN ambassador. She is a diehard Donald Trump loyalist.
Yeah.
Now she also has a very important bureaucratic interest in
Yeah.
keeping the UN relevant to
That's
U.S.
right.
national security and U.S. foreign policy. She's a member of the National
Yeah,
Security Cabinet. It's in
that's right.
her interest to want to demonstrate and show the importance of the value of the UN
Yeah,
to like American national security debates, or else she will be sidelined. So if she were to come
yeah,
out, like I said, guns ablazing, trying to like kneecap the UN as a whole, it would undermine her own standing within debates
yeah,
and discussions, at in the Trump's cabinet. And so she is
yeah,
a savvy enough politician and a bureaucratic operator to understand that sort of making the case for the UN also
yeah.
makes the case for her own relevance in debates within the Trump administration foreign policy. So that's just like
Right.
I think another reason why,
Hmm.
again, like those of us, and I count myself among them, who like think the UN should plays an important role in maintaining peace and stability and security and doing good things around the world, ought to be moderately relieved, not only that she was picked, but how she comported herself during this hearing.
Yeah, and I think we can take like a counterfactual here. If I can put my like international relations professor hat on, then the sort of
You
legal
are. You
outlines of
always
it.
wear it.
Yeah, that's right.
You
I always
you
I always
are.
wear
You
that hat.
literally are.
That's right. In addition to these
IR
like Muppet
professor.
purple headphones, the it's a classic bureaucratic or organizational politics style explanation. Political behavior is driven by the fact that people want to keep their jobs, right? And that they want to be important in their jobs and to have more personnel and greater budget. And because Stefanik is smart, a career political operative who is ideologically flexible, and actually very adept at building political coalitions, the fact that she sees her interest in building up the United States presence at the UN should be heartening to people at
Mhm.
the UN. Now, I will say that the Senate committee did not push her on the fact that the policies that she will be defending do not sit easily in line with the UN Charter. And we don't know how that disjuncture will play out yet. It might not play out at
Mhm.
all. It could be the case that she, like Nikki Haley, finds space to carve out an almost independent foreign policy in some respects to
Mhm.
whatever is happening in Washington. Or it could be the case that let's look at this executive order for a 90-day foreign aid freeze, right? It could be that what is happening out of Washington requires that she find a way to square that circle of
Yeah.
a fundamentally illiberal uh, administration and a fundamentally liberal institution.
Yeah. But here's the kicker, I think, at least
Hmm.
on this question of her bureaucratic incentives to make the UN relevant. I think the conventional
Hmm.
wisdom around DC, and again, we're one day into the Trump administration, is that Rubio may be like a dead man walking, right? That
Oh,
he
sure.
he's not going to last too long, considering how quickly Trump went through his secretaries of state in the first administration, and also
Yeah,
just how odd of a fit Rubio is in this administration, that
yeah,
he's not going to last too long. And so potentially Stefanik, again, maybe getting ahead of myself, might be using her position as UN ambassador to audition for Secretary of State. And it's very typical that that individuals go from UN ambassador to Secretary of State. So it's not out of the realm
yeah,
of possibility that as soon as she becomes Secretary of State, she no longer sees the value and utility in working with the United
hmm,
Nations. Can I ask you? So, like like world events were not
hmm,
discussed too like deeply in
yeah,
this confirmation hearing. There was like one question from Senator Booker about Sudan, a couple of questions
hmm,
about Haiti, a couple about
yeah.
Iran, but
A
as
couple
far
about
as I can
UNIFIL.
tell, yeah, there was
Yeah,
not like much news to be made.
hmm,
We don't
yeah,
yet know like what the Trump administration's approach say to the idea of and to the fact that Kenyan police are supporting Haitian police in Haiti right now, and
yeah,
should that become a UN peacekeeping mission? Should it not? That's like a big debate that's happening at the UN right now. We don't know
yeah,
where the Trump administration stands on that. Um,
yeah,
on Sudan, there was like lip service to working with American partners who are also active participants in this conflict, and it was actually frankly heartening to see Elise Stefanik name the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia as like players that are doing bad things in Sudan
Mhm.
right now. But like, and there was like your regular kind of hawkish Republican talking points on Iran. But on those issues, like not much news was made. We didn't learn much about Trump administration foreign policy.
No, and I think it would have been a surprise if we did. Part of the effort that she is making here is to establish herself as an overall authority on the system as opposed to specific cases. I do think, she did demonstrate that she had learned something about each of those situations as they
Yeah.
were put before her. Um, but she did not have she wasn't asked about them, as you said, right? Like a very few number of people asked her context specific questions. The one that did come up a couple of times, as you said, or the two that came up a couple of times were Haiti and UNIFIL. And she did end
UNIFIL
up
is
talking.
the UN peacekeeping mission in southern Lebanon, for those
That's
who
right.
are
UNIFIL
unaware.
is the UN peacekeeping mission in southern Lebanon. Just an apology for a second. A second dog has walked into the room, so there may be some noise. I didn't know she could open that door by herself, but apparently she can.
Amazing.
The but yeah, so UNIFIL came up a couple of times, and Beautiful came up a couple of times from differing ideological perspectives. So we got both the perspective that it is useless and doesn't do anything, and the perspective that it is actually a necessary part of Lebanese security on
Mm.
either side of the Foreign Relations Committee. And it was my impression, at least, of course, we're all coming to this having just heard it just for once. It was my impression, at least, that she didn't take a strong stance on either point. Right? She did talk extensively about Israeli security. That's the primary concern that she brought up in terms of like foreign policy goals repeatedly. But other than that, she didn't seem to have an extensive uh, argument about UNIFIL.
Yeah, I should say, she did talk like a lot about Israel
Mhm.
and a lot about
That's right.
UNRWA. But I think the reason
That's
you
right.
and I are not talking about that as much is because it's like what's totally expected. Like, of
That's right.
course, she's going to accuse UNRWA of like, supporting Hamas. Of course, she's going to double down on her support for Israel. That's just like, we knew that coming in. We knew that was going to be like a big focus. And frankly, the United States, like the Biden administration, stopped funding UNRWA.
That's right.
Congress has, ordered a cessation of funding for UNRWA. Trump obviously is not going to fund UNRWA, so there's like not much, I
That's
think,
right.
news or too much to discuss there, other than the fact that she very deliberately, as we said earlier, aligned herself with the most extreme elements of Israeli politics right now, saying when
That's
she
right.
said that she agreed that the West Bank is biblically part of Israel, has like a biblical claim to it, which
Yeah.
kind of puts puts the question of a two-state solution and of how the UN deals with Palestine outside the realm of politics, which is deeply problematic. But again, I don't.
Yeah.
It's nothing. I think that was terribly unexpected.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
go
I
ahead.
think the one thing we knew about her foreign policy going into this debate is that she has staked out a position as one of the most staunchly pro-Israel members of the House of Representatives.
Yeah,
And that was in full force at the hearing. Part of the reason it's also, I think, not newsworthy or notable is because, to the extent that she misrepresented anything at the hearing, to the extent that she told things that we know to not be verifiable facts, they were all related to UNRWA. Um,
yeah,
but she did not get any pushback on that because there's bipartisan support for that position.
yeah,
And as a result, it's not newsworthy or noteworthy around the US, right? But I think it will underline how isolated the US is at the UN. When asked about who the US's allies were at the UN, she cited the UK, she cited France, she cited Israel, and then she said it was in her interests to build bridges to the global south. She said this repeatedly. She said it's in US interests to build bridges to the global south. Now, of course, taking a staunchly pro Israel at the expense of all other resolutions approach will not help her build bridges to the
yeah.
global south, where the US is remarkably isolated. But I think it's also worth noting that the whole spectrum of Bush, of
No,
Trump
it's such a
administration
new. It's
foreign
we're only one day
policies.
into it, Anjali. It's
I
okay.
know. Well, I mean, we're 20 years out of the last Bush administration, so I wouldn't give me too much credit. But it is the case that her policies, her ideas in some cases about building bridges to the global south, all of those things are a throwback again to an older school of Republican thought. Like in some ways sounds like she's auditioning to be George H.W. Bush's UN ambassador.
Yeah.
Um,
But can I say
and
what's interesting to me, just following on Elisa, what's interesting to me, and not unexpected, but interesting nonetheless, is how those questions about making inroads to the global south
Mhm,
were framed in the context of competition with China.
that's right.
And so to the extent that like diplomacy towards the global south, which again makes up like most of the membership of the United Nations,
Hmm.
is viewed as being in US interest, it's only being viewed in the context of competition with China. It's to counter China, not to advance anything like positive about
Yeah,
the United States. And so that's gonna they're gonna hit like a reality at some point when they realize that
that's
the
right.
global south are like have agency
Yeah,
and that they're just not like pawns in this great power struggle between the United States and China. But it's
that's right.
very, it's like a myopic thinking, but it's like I think illustrative of how, frankly, like not just Republicans, but the broader foreign policy
Yeah,
community these days
absolutely.
kind of views like the role of the global south, and the UN is an important platform in which engagement with the global south happens.
Yeah, a couple of minutes ago, I brought up a counterfactual, what her hearings could have gone, and I just want to go back to that for a second. And somewhere later down the line, our wonderful producer Levi Sharp will listen to this and like put his head in his hands because I picked up that thread and didn't bring it back until right now. But a counterfactual, hearing here for a Trump administration would be someone in the model of John Bolton or Rick Grinnell, who, despite being someone who, in theory, would also have, a meaningful career stake in the United Nations, would be committed to breaking it, right? They would get in front of that Senate Foreign Relations Committee. They would not care about getting Democratic support for their nomination. They would not care about the sort of larger goals of the organization. They would simply say, this is a wasteful, useless organization and we want to break it. And that is easily how this could have gone, given the sort of other foreign policy predispositions of the Trump
Yeah.
administration. But that's not the way Stefanik approached this hearing. She could easily have been that person, given how willing she is to sort of adopt MAGA ideas. But she's not that person, or
Hmm.
she didn't choose to be that person in this hearing. And I
Well,
think some of that goes back to the sort of fact that Donald Trump is a blank slate in some ways, foreign policy wise. He likes being treated well. He doesn't like being perceived to be not treated well. He likes being feted at the UN.
yeah. I mean, look, I've been doing this for so long that I covered John
Yeah.
Bolton's confirmation
Yeah.
hearings in 2004, 2005. And at
Hmm.
those confirmation hearings, John Bolton explicitly called for entirely voluntary funding of the United Nations. Right now, the UN is
Hmm.
funded through a combination of voluntary funding, like for agencies like the
Yeah.
World Food Program or UNICEF. Those are kind of like charities. But then, like the main
Yeah.
UN entity and UN peacekeeping are done through assessed contributions. Each member state like pays dues payments to the UN. And what John Bolton was advocating for was making it entirely voluntary and pay for the UN you want, not the UN you get. I called it UN
Yeah.
a la carte. And
Yeah.
she could have very much have come out and advocated for like a radical overhaul like that, but she
Yeah.
didn't.
Absolutely. She didn't.
Again, like demonstrating the
Mhm.
kind of norminess. And remember, John Bolton did not get confirmed by the Senate. He was a
No.
recess appointment and then
Yeah.
left because he was, viewed as too extreme at the time.
Yeah.
Um, I wanted to talk about, wait, before we move on from Stefanik's hearing, I did want to talk about the World Health Organization and what happened.
Yeah. That's
Any final
wonderful.
thoughts, any final comments on the confirmation hearing?
Um, one last thing I want to note is that she is now the third UN ambassador that Donald Trump has nominated in a row who is slightly out of step with the rest of his cabinet in terms of the way they approach the UN. I think Stefanik is out of step with the rest of his cabinet in the way they approach the UN because she sees her ambition there. as
Mhm.
opposed to because she has some alternative set of ideas about the world. Kelly Craft didn't really know anything about the UN,
No,
but
she's
when
terrible. Like,
pushed,
not
she was
she was
terrible.
terrible in her confirmation hearing. She
Yeah,
demonstrated an ignorance,
yeah,
that
she didn't learn
neither Nikki
anything about the
Haley
UN.
nor Stefanik
Yeah,
demonstrated. She was like a billionaire donor to the
yeah,
to the Trump campaign, and was conferred the UN ambassadorship for it, and didn't seem
yeah.
to care to learn much about how the UN worked, and was not a
She
member of the
didn't,
cabinet. It should be said.
but even so, when pushed on questions about refugee and migrant rights, right? Kelly Craft said something that was wildly out of step with the Trump administration's policy
Yeah.
at the time, which was that she, thought that refugees and migrants had the right to resettle and that they deserved humanitarian aid and treatment. Now, she obviously didn't have the policy knowledge to know necessarily that that was international law, and she was contravening the Trump administration's contravention of international law. But I think one thing to note is that across these two ambassadors, and possibly with Stefanik, the UN has fared comparatively well on the balance of international organizations under the Trump administration. Not without the very hard and skillful diplomatic work of people around the UN system.
Mhm.
And I think that's worth noting because lots of parts of the international legal architecture have suffered dramatically under this administration in a way the UN system hasn't. And I think we saw a continuation of that here.
Yes, with
But
the
not for the WHO. That's right.
yeah, with the important caveat of the World Health Organization. So let's get into that. Um, so it was always to me an open question of whether or not Trump would actually seek to withdraw from the
Yeah.
WHO in his second term. Now, he did seek to withdraw from it in 2020, but at the time, like his um, withdrawal from the WHO was very transparently a political ploy to
Hmm.
deflect blame for his own incompetent handling of COVID. He sought to shift the blame to the WHO. So the question to me was always, was Trump's opposition to the WHO simply a matter of the political circumstances of the time, right before an election, wanting to, scapegoat at the UN for
Yeah.
his own like incompetent handling of COVID. And that was always kind of an open question. Then you saw over the last couple of months rumors that there was an executive order being prepared that Trump might sign on day one to effectuate a withdrawal from the World Health Organization. Again, it was still always kind of an open question, but then, bam, last night, executive order dropped. The executive order calls for a cessation of U.S. funding to the World Health Organization, and
Hmm.
this is very impactful. The U.S. gives about 18% of
Hmm.
all the WHO's funding, amounting to about like $1.2 billion of the WHO's $6.8 billion two-year budget. It further calls for like a kind of a banning of American officials or American contractors working in US government capacities from like supporting the WHO in one way or another. So if you're like a logistics expert working with the US government who also works with the WHO, you can no longer do it. And it like reassigns all US government officials who work with the WHO to do other things. And that's like a lot of expertise and know-how that's further going to undermine the WHO. And remember, the WHO has a big headquarters in Washington, D.C., the Pan American Health Organization, that kind of beehive
Yeah.
building right by the State Department. Like,
Yeah.
operations there are going to be impacted. This is going to
Yeah.
demonstrably harm the World Health Organization. I wrote a piece. If you're a subscriber to the newsletter, I wrote a piece last night when I saw the news about the executive order, kind of putting how problematic this is in the context of a
Yeah.
fast moving bird flu issue that could turn into a pandemic. And so now we're undermining the one international organization that does global surveillance and monitoring on bird flu, right as bird flu is spreading and potentially becoming more transmissible human to human,
Yeah.
all because of like a political grudge from 2020.
Yeah. I mean, I think as with every other executive order, the executive can say anything they want, But whether or not it is legal, possible, and executable is a second set of stories.
Yeah.
My understanding, at least, is that we would need congressional approval to withdraw from WHO. Is that correct? Or to defund parts of the WHO?
So, like,
Yeah,
funds that have already been appropriated
yeah,
can't technically be withheld, except they probably will be anyway.
yeah.
There's a term of art for this that I'm forgetting at the moment. If you can, if you know what I'm talking about in the messages, you can in the comments you can pop it in there. But it's essentially like a Nixon era thing that they
Hmm.
tried to like withhold funding that Congress appropriated, and it turns out you weren't allowed to do it, but Trump's going to do it anyway, and no
Okay,
one's going to like tell him no. So funding will
right.
be withheld, and it will hurt the WHO. And somehow the WHO is going to need to come up with another
Yeah,
1.3 billion dollars to be able to do what it does.
yeah,
Um, and to the extent that this is a harbinger of U.S. attacks and U.S. plans to defund other UN entities,
yeah.
it's problematic.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there are some things that we can only do together, right? Some kinds of political solutions to problems can only be arrived at collectively. The two classic ones are climate and public health, right? And on both of those fronts, the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement from the World Health Organization, they're not, I mean, so the Paris Agreement is flexible, right? It is designed to withstand a US withdrawal. It doesn't sort of circumvent or it doesn't sabotage the work of the sort of other member states working towards it. But because it reflects an unwillingness on the part of the US to actually invest in climate solutions, it does, right?
Mhm.
So it reflects a problem with US politics that is true regardless of whether or not the US withdraws from the Paris Agreement. Public health is the other classic place where we only collectively can produce solutions to problems by working together, right?
Yeah.
Um, things like the bird flu don't obey national borders, right? Things like wild polio vaccinations don't happen in the
Yeah.
absence of collective effort. And again, the withdrawal from the World Health Organization as a result reflects an unwillingness to work towards collective solutions.
Mhm.
The problem is in this case, it isn't true, regardless of whether or not the US withdraws, right? So the US withdrawing is the problem in this case, as opposed to some underlying goal that the US does or doesn't want to advance, right? So withdrawing its funds and taking them home is a major problem for the organization in a way that withdrawing for the Paris Agreement is not.
Yeah. Yeah, and just this fundamental idea that human health is interconnected and that we ought to
Hmm.
work together in order
Yeah.
to solve common problems related to global health and infectious disease. It's just like, it sounds idealistic, but it's rooted in fundamental national interests that
Yeah.
diseases don't respect borders. So you're going to want to
Yeah.
strengthen the health system. There, you have an interest in the United
Yeah.
States to make sure that there is good surveillance of Ebola, of bird flu in like
Yeah.
Liberia, and good ways to contain and deal with it there, so it doesn't spread over borders. Now, what's interesting is the executive order kind of recognizes this, and it directs
Hmm.
the Secretary of State to put together coalitions and groups and organizations and come together in to basically replicate what the WHO is already doing. And
Yeah.
again, this just inadvertently, potentially, from their perspective, just demonstrates the value of the WHO. It
Yeah, that's
exists
right.
to lower transaction costs, both in terms of time and money, in providing a platform for cooperating on global health issues. And now, by kneecapping the WHO, you're really inadvertently, in my view, doing harm to America's health and security and health security together.
Yeah, but I think it's worth noting. I mean, this is not just a political grudge, right? I mean, this administration is in theory going to be staffed by people who think Americans shouldn't get vaccines, right? Like who don't see the value
There's
of
that.
public health because they don't see the value of public health, right?
Yeah.
It's not just that Donald Trump has a grudge against the World Health Organization, although he does. It's the fact that they don't think you should be vaccinated against smallpox because, people 150 years ago weren't. And what happened to them? They were fine, except for the ones who died, right? Like that's the
Yeah,
issue. It's unclear, I think, to me whether or not we will see the full scale capture
yeah,
of the U.S. or the sort of presidential cabinet by people who think public health isn't real. Forget about whether or not we should fund the WHO.
yeah. So this has been fun. How about if you have a moment,
Mhm.
take a question from the audience. I didn't ask you ahead of time what your time constraints were.
I have to go in just a couple of minutes, but
How about,
I
yeah,
have
let's do
a
a question
category.
or two from
Hmm.
from audience if there are. I suppose this is the first time we've done this. I suppose you can just type your question in that little message box. We'll give a minute for or two for someone to ask a question. But this is fun. Let's do it again. No questions. Crickets from the audience, unless someone's not typing fast enough.
We had
Um,
the note that it's impounding funds.
it's not impound. It's like
Mm-hmm.
it's a different term,
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Emily Smith. Sorry,
Mm-hmm.
I'll think of it as soon as I get off this live stream. Anyway, we can end it there. Anjali, as always, this was great, and thank you
Yeah, thanks for
all
talking.
for participating. And look, we need your support. I'll plug it right now. You're on the app. Please get a paid subscription to Global Dispatches, which will give you full access to Save Us from Hell. Our full episodes are behind a paywall. And you'd also be able to support our work as we help make sense of Trump's approach to internationalism in this new era. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining. Stay safe.
Stay safe. Bye. All right, I'll hit the little stop button here. Oh, how do you do this? End.